The Williams family's car wound its way up the narrow, winding road, the dense forest on either side casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. The towering peaks of the mountains loomed ahead, their snow-capped tips gleaming against the deepening blue of the sky. As they rounded the final bend, the mansion came into view, its dark silhouette framed against the backdrop of the rugged terrain. "Wow," Sophie Williams breathed from the back seat, her wide eyes taking in the sprawling Gothic architecture of their new home. The mansion stood grand and imposing, its stone facade weathered by time, but still exuding a sense of eerie elegance. Mr. Williams pulled the car to a stop in the gravel driveway, the sound of crunching stones breaking the heavy silence that seemed to hang over the place. "Home sweet home," he announced, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. He glanced at his wife, Mary, who sat beside him with a look of cautious optimism. "It has potential," Mary said, her voice tinged with both hope and apprehension. She was a practical woman, not easily swayed by appearances, but even she couldn't deny the mansion's undeniable charm, if one could look past its ominous aura. Ethan, their youngest, jumped out of the car first, his boundless energy undeterred by the foreboding atmosphere. "Look at this place. It's like a castle." "Be careful, Ethan," Mary called after him as he ran towards the massive wooden front doors. Sophie followed more slowly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, her artistic mind already buzzing with inspiration from the mansion's haunting beauty. The family stood together on the front steps, the keys jangling in Mr. Williams' hand. He took a deep breath and unlocked the door, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the vast, empty halls inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting an otherworldly glow on the faded tapestries and antique furniture that filled the rooms. The air was cool and musty, carrying the scent of age and neglect. "Let's start unpacking," Mary said, trying to mask her unease with a smile. "We have a lot of work to do to make this place feel like home." As the family busied themselves with unloading the car and exploring their new abode, the mansion seemed to watch them with silent, brooding eyes. Shadows lengthened in the corners of the rooms, and the old walls seemed to whisper secrets long forgotten. Sophie wandered up the grand staircase, her fingers trailing along the intricately carved banister. She paused at the top, gazing down the long corridor lined with closed doors. One of them, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon her. Pushing the door open, she stepped into a small, dusty room. An old rocking chair sat in one corner, and a large, ornate mirror hung on the opposite wall. But it was the desk under the window that caught her attention. On it lay an old, tattered diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. Curiosity piqued, Sophie picked up the diary and opened it, the yellowed pages crackling under her touch. The handwriting inside was delicate and flowing, the ink faded but still legible. She read the first entry, dated over a century ago, and felt a chill run down her spine. April 3rd, 1892. My name is Emily Sinclair, and I fear that something terrible is happening in this house. Unaware of the dark journey they were about to embark on, the Williams family settled into the mansion, each of them unaware that the spirits of the past were awakening, and that their arrival had stirred something malevolent that had lain dormant for far too long. The first night in the mansion was an uneasy one. The family huddled around the fireplace in the grand parlor, trying to create a sense of warmth and comfort amidst the vast, chilly expanse of their new home. Shadows flickered on the walls, and the crackling fire was the only sound breaking the silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. As the evening wore on, they gradually retired to their respective rooms. Ethan, with his boundless energy finally spent, fell asleep almost immediately. Sophie, however, lay awake in her bed, the tattered diary of Emily Sinclair resting on her bedside table. The words she had read earlier echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, a faint whispering sound reached her ears. She sat up, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to come from the hallway outside her door. Heart-pounding, Sophie slipped out of bed and crept to the door, opening it just a crack. The corridor was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a child's voice, soft and plaintive. Sophie's curiosity got the better of her fear, and she stepped into the hallway. As she moved down the corridor, the whispers seemed to guide her, leading her to a door at the end of the hall. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Gathering her courage, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished, much like the one where she had found the diary. The whispering ceased as she stepped inside, replaced by an oppressive silence. In the center of the room stood an old toy chest, its lid slightly ajar. Sophie approached the chest, her heart racing. She knelt down and lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of old, dusty toys. Among them was a porcelain doll, its glass eyes staring blankly at her. She reached out to pick it up, but the moment her fingers touched the doll, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She gasped, dropping the doll back into the chest. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet, and she could see her breath in the air. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped. She rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the whispering resumed, louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around her, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Just as she felt she couldn't take it any longer, the door burst open, and her father stood there looking bewildered and concerned. "Sophie! What are you doing in here?" he demanded. Tears streaming down her face, Sophie rushed into his arms. I heard whispers," she stammered. "They led me here." Mr. Williams glanced around the room, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "It's just an old room, Sophie. There's nothing here." He led her back to her bedroom, trying to reassure her, but the unease lingered. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast in the large, sunlit dining room. The atmosphere was tense, and everyone seemed on edge. Mary noticed the dark circles under Sophie's eyes and the way she kept glancing nervously around. "Did anyone else hear anything strange last night?" Sophie asked hesitantly, her gaze darting between her parents and brother. Ethan shook his head, but Mary and Mr. Williams exchanged a troubled look. "I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway," Mary admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But when I checked, there was no one there." Mr. Williams sighed, rubbing his temples. "This house is old. It's bound to make noises. We're just not used to it yet. Let's not let our imaginations get the best of us." But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just old house noises. She resolved to learn more about Emily Sinclair and the events that had transpired in the mansion all those years ago. Little did she know, the past was far from finished with the Williams family, and the echoes of the tragic history would soon become impossible to ignore. Ethan's room was filled with sunlight streaming through the tall, mullioned windows, casting playful patterns on the wooden floor. He sat cross-legged on his bed, absorbed in a new comic book, the eerie events of the previous night already fading from his young mind. The house seemed quieter during the day, its shadows less menacing under the bright light of the sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere shifted, growing heavier with an almost palpable tension. Ethan looked up from his comic book, feeling a sudden chill despite the warmth of the room. The air seemed to thicken, and a sense of unease settled over him. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to deepen and move. "Mom?" he called out, his voice quivering slightly. But no answer came. He swung his legs off the bed and stood up, his eyes never leaving the corner where the darkness seemed to pulse and writhe. As he took a step closer, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a twisted, sinister smile. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and he stumbled backward, his heart pounding wildly. "Mom! Dad!" he screamed, his voice breaking the heavy silence. He turned and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through him, and he pounded on the door, desperate to escape the malevolent presence behind him. Just as the figure reached out a skeletal hand, the door flew open, and Mr. Williams rushed in, followed closely by Mary. The shadowy figure vanished instantly, leaving only the cold, oppressive air behind. "Ethan, what happened?" Mr. Williams demanded, his face pale and worried. There was a man," Ethan stammered, pointing toward the now empty corner. "He was right there." Mary knelt beside her son, wrapping her arms around him. "It's okay, Ethan. You're safe now. It was just a bad dream." Ethan shook his head vehemently. "No, it wasn't a dream. He was real. He was right there." Mr. Williams exchanged a grim look with Mary. "Let's all go downstairs," he said. "We need to talk." In the parlor, with a fire crackling in the hearth to ward off the growing chill, the family gathered to discuss the strange occurrences. Sophie clutched Emily Sinclair's diary to her chest, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "This place is haunted," Ethan declared, his voice trembling. "We need to leave." "Calm down, Ethan," Mr. Williams said gently, though his own fear was evident in his eyes. "We need to figure out what's going on. Sophie, you mentioned finding a diary?" Sophie nodded, opening the diary to a marked page. It belonged to Emily Sinclair. She wrote about strange events and a shadowy figure just like Ethan described. She read aloud from the diary, her voice shaking as she recounted Emily's words. "There is a darkness in this house, a malevolent presence that watches us. It has taken father and mother, and I fear it will take me too. The Shadow Man is real, and he is coming for us all." A heavy silence fell over the room as Sophie finished reading. The family exchanged fearful glances, the reality of their situation sinking in. "We need to get help," Mary said firmly. "There must be someone who can tell us more about this place." Mr. Williams nodded. "I'll go into town tomorrow and see what I can find out. In the meantime, we stick together. No one goes anywhere alone." That night, the family huddled together in the parlor, the fire casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Despite their efforts to stay calm, the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion weighed heavily on them all. As they sat in silence, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old house groan. Somewhere in the darkness, a soft whispering began again, just barely audible over the crackling of the fire. The Williams family was not alone in the mansion, and the spirits of the past were growing restless. The first encounter had been a warning, but darker, more terrifying experiences lay ahead, and the true nature of the evil that haunted the mansion was yet to be revealed. The following morning, Mr. Williams set out for the small town nestled at the foot of the mountains. The air was crisp, and the path winding down through the dense forest seemed eerily quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every rustle in the underbrush made him glance nervously over his shoulder. The town itself was quaint and picturesque, with old brick buildings lining the main street. As Mr. Williams parked the car, he noticed the townspeople casting curious, almost wary glances in his direction. He walked briskly to the local library, hoping to find some answers. The library was a small, dusty building filled with the scent of old books and polished wood. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, looked up from her desk as he entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Good morning," Mr. Williams greeted her with a forced smile. "I'm new in town. My family and I just moved into the old mansion in the mountains, and I was hoping you might have some information about its history." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded. "The Sinclair mansion," she murmured. "That place has quite the history, Mr. Williams," he supplied. "James Williams. What can you tell me about the Sinclairs?" Mrs. Henderson sighed, rising slowly from her chair. "Follow me," she said, leading him to a secluded corner of the library where the town's historical records were kept. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume and set it on the table before them. "The Sinclair family moved into the mansion in the late 1800s, she began, flipping through the yellowed pages. They were wealthy and well-respected, but their time there was marred by tragedy. The father, Thomas Sinclair, was a prominent businessman, and his wife, Margaret, was known for her charitable work. They had a daughter, Emily, who was just a child when the troubles began." Mr. Williams leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of troubles?" Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper. "Strange occurrences plagued the household. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and sightings of a shadowy figure. Thomas Sinclair became obsessed with finding the source of these disturbances. He believed the mansion was built on cursed land, but others in town whispered of darker things, rituals and pacts with malevolent forces." She turned a page, revealing a faded photograph of the Sinclair family. "In the end, it all came to a head one fateful night. Thomas and Margaret were found dead in the mansion, their bodies horribly mutilated. Emily disappeared without a trace. Some say she was taken by the dark entity that haunted their home, while others believe she ran away, driven mad by the horrors she witnessed." Mr. Williams shivered, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on him. "And this shadowy figure, the one Emily mentioned in her diary." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were filled with sorrow and fear. "The Shadow Man. He is said to be a manifestation of the darkness that dwells in the mansion. A vengeful spirit, or perhaps something even older and more sinister. Many believe he's the one who brought ruin to the Sinclairs, and now seeks to claim anyone who dares live in that house." Back at the mansion, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She spent the day in her room, reading more of Emily's diary. Each entry was filled with increasing fear and despair, painting a vivid picture of the terror that had consumed the young girl's life. Ethan, despite his previous night's fright, tried to carry on as usual, playing with his toys and exploring the mansion's many rooms. But he couldn't forget the hollow eyes and twisted smile of the Shadow Man. Every creak and groan of the old house sent shivers down his spine. Mary busied herself with unpacking and organizing, trying to create a semblance of normalcy. But her mind was constantly on edge, every unexplained noise making her heart race. She was grateful when Mr. Williams finally returned, his face pale and grave. He gathered the family in the parlor, the flickering fire casting long shadows on the walls. "I spoke with the librarian," he began, his voice tense. "The Sinclair family suffered greatly in this house. They were tormented by the same dark presence we've encountered." He recounted the tragic history of the Sinclairs, the eerie parallels to their own experiences sending chills through the room. "We need to find a way to protect ourselves and, If possible, put these spirits to rest, he concluded. We can't let the past destroy us. That night, as the family huddled together, the mansion seemed to come alive with a new intensity. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, and the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent. The Williams family was beginning to understand the true horror of their situation. The spirits of the Sinclairs were reaching out to them, seeking help, or perhaps vengeance, and the Shadow Man was growing stronger, feeding on their fear. The past had awakened, and it would not be silenced easily. The Williams family sat around the dining table, their faces etched with anxiety and determination. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the encroaching night, but the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion seeped through the walls. We need help, Mary said firmly, breaking the tense silence. This isn't something we can handle on our own. Mr. Williams nodded. I'll call Madame Zara. She's a medium. I heard about her from the librarian. If anyone can help us understand what's happening, it's her. The following evening, Madame Zara arrived. She was an enigmatic woman, her presence commanding and slightly unsettling. Dressed in flowing dark robes, her eyes seemed to pierce through the gloom of the mansion as she surveyed her surroundings. This house has seen much pain, she murmured as she entered, her gaze lingering on the dark corners and shadowed hallways. The spirits here are restless. In the dimly lit parlor, the family gathered around a small table with Madame Zara at the head. The flickering candles cast eerie shadows, their flames dancing in the drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Please join hands, Madame Zara instructed, her voice low and melodic. We must connect our energies to reach the spirits. Reluctantly, the family complied, their hands cold and trembling. Madame Zara closed her eyes and began to chant softly, her words foreign and hypnotic. The air grew colder and the shadows seemed to deepen. We seek the spirits of this house, Madame Zara intoned. We seek the truth of the tragedy that befell the Sinclair family. Show yourselves to us. For a moment there was only silence, and then a faint, almost imperceptible whispering filled the room. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature dropped sharply. Sophie shivered, clutching her mother's hand tightly. We are here, a voice whispered through Madame Zara, her eyes snapping open but now clouded, distant. We are the Sinclairs. We are trapped. The room seemed to darken, the shadows pressing in closer. Madame Zara's voice changed, becoming that of a frightened young girl. Help us, she pleaded, her expression twisting in fear. He won't let us go. The Shadow Man. He's here. A sudden, forceful gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The table shook, and the family clung to each other, terrified. Why are you here? Madame Zara's voice demanded, now deep and menacing. Why do you disturb the Dark One's slumber? Ethan's eyes widened and he pointed to the corner of the room. There! He's here! In the corner, a figure began to take shape, emerging from the shadows. The Shadow Man stood tall and menacing, his hollow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. His presence was suffocating, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. Leave this place, Madame Zara commanded, her voice straining with the effort. You have no power here. The Shadow Man's smile twisted into a sneer, and he took a step forward. You are wrong, he hissed, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. This house is mine. Their souls are mine. The air crackled with energy, and the room seemed to close in around them. Madame Zara's face contorted in pain as she struggled to maintain control. We must break the connection, she shouted, Release hands!" The family pulled their hands apart, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. Madame Zara collapsed forward, gasping for breath. The shadow man faded back into the darkness, his malevolent presence lingering. "We have learned much," Madame Zara said weakly, her voice trembling. "The shadow man is a powerful, ancient entity. He feeds on fear and despair. The Sinclairs are trapped, their souls bound to him. To free them, we must find a way to banish him, but it will not be easy." The family sat in stunned silence, the weight of their situation settling heavily upon them. They had reached out to the spirits, and now they understood the true nature of the evil that haunted their home. As Madame Zara left, she gave them a warning. "The Shadow Man will not give up easily. He will fight to keep his hold on this place. You must be strong, and you must be united. Only then will you stand a chance." That night, the Williams family huddled together, the fear of what lay ahead binding them closer. The darkness outside seemed to press against the walls, and the whispering voices continued to haunt their dreams. The battle for their home and their souls had only just begun. The days following the seance were a blur of fear and tension. The Williams family felt the Shadow Man's presence grow stronger, his influence more oppressive. Every creak, every whisper seemed filled with menace. One evening, as the family gathered in the parlor, the atmosphere grew noticeably colder. The fire in the hearth sputtered, and the shadows seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Ethan clung to his mother, his eyes wide with fear. "I can feel him," Sophie whispered, clutching Emily Sinclair's diary. "He's here watching us." Mr. Williams stood, his face pale but determined. "We need to find the source of his power," he said. "Something is anchoring him to this house." The family agreed to search the mansion, hoping to find clues that could lead them to the root of the malevolent force. They started in the basement, a dark, damp place filled with forgotten relics and decaying memories. As they descended the creaking stairs, a foul odor assaulted their senses, and the air grew thick with the weight of the past. They split up, each taking a section of the basement to search. Sophie found herself drawn to a small, hidden alcove at the far end. Pushing aside a stack of old crates, she uncovered a rusted iron door, partially obscured by cobwebs. "Dad, come here," she called, her voice echoing in the dim space. Mr. Williams joined her, his brow furrowed. "What did you find, Sophie?" "It's a door," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "It looks ancient." They forced the door open, revealing a small, hidden room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange, dusty artifacts. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in dark stains and surrounded by black candles. "This must be where the rituals took place," Mr. Williams murmured, his voice filled with dread. "This is where the Shadow Man was summoned." Mary joined them, her face pale. "We need to destroy whatever is binding him here," she said. "We need to break his power." As they examined the altar, they found a worn, leather-bound book filled with strange symbols and incantations. Sophie flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she recognized some of the symbols from Emily's diary. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is how we can banish him." Just as they began to formulate a plan, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the flickering candlelight dimmed. The Shadow Man appeared, his hollow eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "You think you can defeat me?" he hissed, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I am eternal. I am the darkness." Mr. Williams stepped forward, holding the book tightly. "We will banish you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. You have no power over us." The Shadow Man laughed, a sound that chilled them to their bones. "You are fools," he snarled. "This house is mine, and you will never escape." The air crackled with energy as the Shadow Man advanced, his presence filling the room with dread. The Williams family stood their ground, their resolve unwavering. They had faced the darkness, and they were determined to fight back. As the Shadow Man raised his hand, a wave of cold energy surged toward them, knocking them to the ground. Sophie clutched the book, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus on the incantations. "We need to perform the ritual," she cried. "It's the only way." Mary and Mr. Williams helped her to her feet, their faces set with determination. Together, they began to chant the incantation, their voices growing stronger with each word. The Shadow Man roared in anger, his form flickering and distorting as the power of the ritual took hold. "No!" he screamed. "You cannot banish me!" The room shook violently, and the shelves of artifacts toppled, crashing to the floor. The Williams family continued to chant, their voices rising above the chaos. As the final words of the incantation echoed through the room, the Shadow Man let out a piercing scream. His form disintegrated, dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that was sucked into the altar. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature began to rise. The Williams family collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. They had faced the malevolent force that haunted their home and emerged triumphant. But they knew their battle was not yet over. The Shadow Man's influence might have been weakened, but the spirits of the Sinclairs were still trapped, and the mansion held many more secrets yet to be uncovered. The fight for their home and their souls was far from finished. Days passed, and the Williams family tried to regain a sense of normalcy, but the mansion's dark presence lingered. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the old house set their nerves on edge. Despite their victory over the Shadow Man, they couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent still lurked within the walls. Mr. Williams, once the steadfast anchor of the family, began to change. He grew increasingly irritable, his eyes haunted by sleepless nights and dark thoughts. Mary watched helplessly as her husband became a shadow of his former self, his descent into madness accelerated by the lingering influence of the house. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mr. Williams sat silently at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. The food on his plate remained untouched, and his hands trembled slightly. "James, are you okay?" Mary asked gently, reaching out to touch his hand. He jerked away, his eyes flashing with anger. "I'm fine," he snapped, his voice edged with a bitterness that sent a shiver down Mary's spine. "Just leave me alone." Sophie and Ethan exchanged worried glances, their father's behavior unsettling them. They had always seen him as strong and dependable, but now he seemed to be slipping away from them, consumed by the darkness of the mansion. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the groaning of the wooden beams, the whispering wind, and the distant, almost imperceptible voices that seemed to call her name. She clutched Emily's diary to her chest, the words of the long-dead girl a source of both comfort and dread. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from the hallway. She sat up, straining to listen. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She crept to her door and opened it a crack, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Her father stood at the end of the hall, his back to her. He was muttering to himself, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him. He seemed to be arguing with someone, though no one else was there. "Dad?" she called softly, her voice trembling. Mr. Williams turned slowly, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Sophie," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "They're coming for us. We have to stop them." She took a tentative step forward. "Who's coming, Dad?" "The spirits," he replied, his gaze darting around as if expecting to see them emerge from the shadows. "They want to take us. They won't stop until we're all gone." Sophie's blood ran cold. She had seen the toll the house had taken on her father, but this was something different. He was unraveling, losing his grip on reality. "We need to get help," she said softly. "Mom will know what to do." "No!" Mr. Williams shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. "She doesn't understand. None of you understand." Sophie backed away, fear gripping her. She turned and ran to her parents' bedroom, bursting through the door. "Mom! Something's wrong with Dad!" Mary sprang out of bed, her heart racing. "What happened?" "He's in the hallway," Sophie gasped, tears streaming down her face. "He's saying the spirits are coming for us." Mary followed Sophie back to the hallway, where Mr. Williams stood, his expression vacant and haunted. "James," she said gently, approaching him. "Come back to bed. We'll figure this out together." He shook his head violently. "No, Mary. It's too late. They're here." As if on cue, a cold wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing the lights and plunging them into darkness. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with their chilling presence. Mr. Williams collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "Make them stop!" he cried, his voice filled with agony. "Please, make them stop!" Mary knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around him. "We're here, James. We'll get through this. Just hold on." But as she held him, she felt the cold touch of the spirits closing in around them, their malevolent whispers filling her mind with fear and despair. She realized with a sinking feeling that the battle was far from over. The house had claimed its first victim, and the rest of them were teetering on the edge of the same abyss. The following days were a blur of confusion and fear. Mr. Williams' condition worsened, his mind slipping further into madness. He wandered the halls at all hours, muttering to himself and lashing out at unseen entities. The rest of the family could do little but watch helplessly, their own sanity fraying under the constant strain. The mansion had them in its grip, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them all. The Williams family gathered in the parlor, the flickering fire casting long shadows on their faces. The once grand room now felt like a tomb, its heavy curtains drawn against the darkness outside. Mr. Williams sat slumped in an armchair, his eyes vacant and unseeing. His descent into madness had left him a shell of the man he once was. Mary stood by the mantel, clutching Emily Sinclair's diary in one hand and the worn ritual book in the other. "We have to end this," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We have to banish the Shadow Man and free the spirits of the Sinclairs." Sophie and Ethan nodded, their faces pale but determined. They had seen too much to back down now. "What do we need to do?" Sophie asked, her voice steady. Mary opened the ritual book, flipping to the marked page. "We need to perform a ritual in the hidden room in the basement," she said. "It's where the dark magic was first invoked. We'll need candles, salt, and the relics we found there." The family gathered the necessary items, their movements swift and purposeful. They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The hidden room loomed ahead, its iron door ajar as if inviting them in. As they entered the room, the oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them. The shadows seemed to writhe with anticipation, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie patterns on the walls. Mary arranged the candles in a circle around the altar, sprinkling salt to form a protective barrier. "Everyone stand inside the circle," she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to stay together." They stood within the salt circle, their hands joined as Mary began to chant the incantation from the ritual book. The words were ancient and powerful, resonating through the room with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. As the incantation continued, the air grew colder and the shadows deepened. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo, filling the room with a cacophony of fear and despair. The candles flickered wildly, their flames struggling against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, the Shadow Man appeared, his form emerging from the darkness like a wraith. His hollow eyes glowed with malevolent fury, and his twisted smile sent chills down their spines. "You dare to challenge me?" he hissed, his voice echoing through the room. "You are fools. This house is mine, and I will never let you go." Mary's voice grew stronger as she continued the incantation, the words filling the room with a power that seemed to push back against the Shadow Man's presence. "By the light of these candles, by the salt that protects us, we banish you, Shadow Man. Your hold on this place is broken." The Shadow Man roared in anger, his form flickering and distorting as the power of the ritual took hold. "You cannot defeat me!" he screamed, his voice filled with rage. "I am eternal!" The room shook violently, and the relics on the shelves toppled to the floor. The air crackled with energy as the Shadow Man fought against the power of the incantation, his form flickering like a dying flame. Sophie clutched the diary tightly, her voice joining her mother's in the chant. "By the spirits of the Sinclairs, we command you to leave this place. Your reign of terror is over." The Shadow Man let out a piercing scream as his form began to disintegrate, dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that was sucked into the altar. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room grew warmer, the shadows retreating. The family collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. They had faced the darkness and emerged triumphant. The oppressive presence of the Shadow Man was gone, and the mansion seemed to sigh with relief. As they helped each other to their feet, the room filled with the soft, ethereal light. The spirits of the Sinclair family appeared before them, their forms shimmering like mist. Emily stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. "You have freed us." Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We couldn't have done it without you, Emily. You showed us the way." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light. "We can finally rest," Emily said, her voice growing faint. "Be at peace." The light faded, and the room was once again filled with the warm glow of the candles. The Williams family stood in silence, the weight of their victory settling over them. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. As they ascended from the basement, the mansion seemed to welcome them, its oppressive atmosphere replaced with a sense of tranquility. The Shadow Man was gone, and the spirits of the Sinclairs were at peace. But the family knew that their ordeal had changed them. They had faced their deepest fears and emerged victorious, but the memory of the darkness would stay with them, a reminder of the battle they had fought and won. The mansion was no longer a place of fear, but a testament to their strength and resilience. The Williams family had faced the malevolent force and triumphed, their bond stronger than ever. The morning after their confrontation with the Shadow Man, the mansion felt different. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a tentative peace. The Williams family gathered in the kitchen, their faces showing the weariness of their ordeal. but also a glimmer of hope. "We did it," Mary said, her voice filled with relief. "We freed the Sinclairs, and we banished the Shadow Man." Mr. Williams, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks, nodded. "But we can't stay here. This house still holds too many memories, too much pain." Sophie and Ethan agreed, their youthful faces reflecting a mix of determination and lingering fear. They had fought bravely, but the mansion's dark history had left its mark on them all. As they packed their belongings, the house seemed almost to breathe a sigh of relief, its dark secrets finally laid to rest. The family worked together in a harmonious silence, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured. Just as they were about to leave, Sophie felt a strange tugging at her heart. She turned and walked back to the parlor, where Emily Sinclair's diary lay on a table. She picked it up, feeling the weight of the past in her hands. "Are you coming, Sophie?" Ethan called from the doorway. She nodded, slipping the diary into her backpack. "I just needed to make sure we didn't leave anything behind." With one last look at the mansion that had been both a home and a nightmare, the family stepped out into the bright morning light. The air was crisp and clear, and the oppressive presence that had once filled the estate was gone. As they drove down the winding mountain road, a sense of liberation washed over them. The mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror, its dark silhouette fading into the distance. The nightmare was over, and they were free. But as they neared the edge of the forest, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread gripped Sophie. She turned to look back at the mansion, her heart pounding. The air grew colder, and she saw a shadow flit across the road behind them. "Dad, stop the car!" she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Mr. Williams hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the gravel road. "What's wrong, Sophie?" I think we need to go back," she said, her voice trembling. "I feel like we missed something." Mary frowned. "We've been through so much, Sophie. Are you sure?" Sophie nodded, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "I can't explain it, but I feel like we didn't finish what we started. We need to make sure the Shadow Man is truly gone." Reluctantly, the family turned the car around and drove back to the mansion. As they approached, the sky darkened, and a cold wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves with an eerie whisper. They entered the mansion cautiously, the once peaceful atmosphere now heavy with foreboding. The shadows seemed to deepen as they made their way back to the hidden room in the basement. The iron door stood ajar, and the room beyond was filled with an unnatural darkness. Sophie stepped forward, the diary clutched in her hands. "We need to perform the ritual one last time, to make sure he's truly gone." The family gathered around the altar once more, their faces grim with determination. Mary began the chant, her voice steady and strong. As the incantation filled the room, the air grew colder and the shadows seemed to writhe with anger. Suddenly, the Shadow Man appeared, his form more terrifying than before. "You cannot defeat me!" he roared, his voice echoing through the room. "This house is mine!" Sophie stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "No, it's not. You have no power here. We banish you once and for all." With a final desperate effort, the family completed the ritual. The Shadow Man let out a piercing scream, his form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke that was sucked into the altar. The room shook violently, and then all was still. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a serene, almost holy light. The air was warm, and the sense of dread that had haunted them was gone. The Williams family stood together, their faces reflecting both exhaustion and triumph. They had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. As they left the mansion for the last time, The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the estate in a golden light. The nightmare was over, and the house that had once been a place of terror was now just an empty shell, its dark history finally put to rest. They drove away, the mansion growing smaller in the distance. The road ahead was bright and clear, and for the first time in a long while, they felt a true sense of peace. The past was behind them, and a new chapter awaited. The Williams family had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. They had escaped the haunted mansion, but the memory of their ordeal would stay with them, a reminder of their strength and resilience. As they drove toward their new future, the spirits of the past were finally at peace, and the malevolent force that had haunted them was banished forever.